She was America's sweetheart, the radiant bride in the most watched wedding in daytime history. But behind the smile, one 9-year-old Genie Francis was living a nightmare. The romance that made her famous began with a rape, rewritten by the network into a fairy tale love story. While millions cheered, Genie was breaking inside, mocked for her body, discarded when she no longer fit the fantasy, and left to hide decades of pain. At 62, she has finally broken her silence. This is the truth about the woman Hollywood tried to erase. In 1981, America witnessed what was later called the wedding of the century. Luke and Laura's marriage wasn't just a soap opera plot twist, it was a cultural phenomenon. On that November day, more than 30 million people tuned in, making it the most watched daytime episode in television history. Offices paused, classrooms whispered, families gathered around their sets. For a brief moment, the entire country seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Laura to walk down the aisle and hear Luke say, "I do." Genie Francis, barely 19 years old, stood in front of the cameras in a flowing white gown. To the public, she wasn't just an actress. She was the embodiment of love itself, a symbol of romance in its purest form. She became a teen idol overnight, a dream painted onto America's collective imagination. Laura was no longer just a character, she was transformed into the very ideal of what love was supposed to look like. But what the cheering crowds never realized was that Genie was still a child herself. She had never been in love, never truly believed in happy endings, never even lived long enough to understand what marriage really meant. The role demanded she carry the weight of an entire nation's fantasies, yet she hadn't even finished learning who she was. And there was a darker truth hidden in plain sight. The first major scene between Luke and Laura, the very relationship the audience celebrated, had begun as an assault, rewritten by the network into a love story. The fairy tale wedding was built on top of a wound. America celebrated Laura's perfect romance, while Genie silently endured the knowledge that none of it was real, and that her innocence had been taken not just in story, but in how the industry forced her to play along. That day, as the cameras captured a beaming bride, Genie Francis stood under the studio lights, knowing she wasn't living a dream, she was trapped inside a nightmare dressed up as love. Beneath the glossy headlines and the cheers of millions was a truth so unsettling it would stain the rest of Genie Francis's career. The love story of Luke and Laura, the very tale that made daytime television history, did not begin with romance at all. It began with violence. In 1979, Laura was written into a storyline where she was assaulted by Luke, a hustler portrayed as charming yet dangerous. Genie was only 17 when she was told to perform the scene. Too young to fully grasp the weight of what was happening, she stood under the lights, directed by men twice her age, and acted out a moment of trauma that was quickly twisted into something else. Instead of allowing Laura to express pain or showing the consequences of such an act, the network rewrote the story into the foundation of a sweeping romance. What should have been remembered as a crime was reframed as passion. The audience loved it. Ratings soared, and America cheered for a couple born of contradiction. But Genie was left with scars the viewers never saw. She was instructed to look at her attacker not with fear, but with longing, to turn horror into desire. And no one around her asked how she felt, if she was frightened, or if she understood the implications. The only response she ever heard was, "The audience likes it. Keep going." From that moment, she realized that her feelings no longer mattered. The industry had decided her pain was expendable if it served the story. While America embraced Luke and Laura as a dream couple, Genie carried the nightmare of knowing that her most celebrated work was built on a distortion that violated both her character's truth and her own. For decades, Genie Francis perfected the art of survival by wearing a mask. On the outside, she appeared gentle, agreeable, always ready to smile on cue. She became Hollywood's vision of the perfect ingenue, obedient, gracious, forever accommodating. But behind that carefully constructed image was a young woman collapsing under the weight of expectations she never chose. Depression quietly took root in her teenage years. long before she had the language to name it. There were days when the loneliness was so sharp she wished she could simply vanish. The tabloids mocked her relentlessly for something as natural as gaining weight, magnifying every pound as though her body was public property. Strangers, critics, and producers alike reminded her that she was supposed to be America's sweetheart, and sweethearts weren't allowed to change. The contradiction was unbearable. As Laura, she was adored, applauded, and immortalized in the cultural imagination. But as Genie, she was invisible, diminished, pushed aside by the very industry that had built its success on her shoulders. She was made to apologize for growing older, for no longer fitting into the frozen snapshot of the all-American girl that audiences wanted to cling to. Hollywood celebrated Laura's wedding, but when Genie struggled, when she needed compassion, the applause stopped and the doors slammed shut. To the public, she was still a shining symbol of purity. To herself, she was a prisoner forced to suppress her real pain so completely that she almost disappeared beneath the character she had created. And yet, through it all, she stayed silent, hiding behind that mask of obedience, because silence was the only weapon she believed she had. Hollywood has a way of applauding you in one breath and discarding you in the next. For Genie Francis, the betrayal came swift and merciless. After years of embodying Laura, the role that made General Hospital a cultural landmark, she was quietly pushed aside. The same industry that once paraded her as America's sweetheart now treated her as replaceable, as though she were a costume that no longer fit the show's image. Producers didn't hesitate to recast her, as if the young woman who had poured her soul into Laura could simply be swapped out without consequence. Genie was diminished, sidelined, and worst of all, forced to apologize for something beyond her control, for aging, for gaining weight, for no longer looking like the frozen version of the all-American girl that the audience had etched into memory decades earlier. It was a cruel irony. The character she had created was celebrated with flowers, applause, and media adoration, yet the actress behind her was left standing in the shadows. Laura Spencer was immortalized in daytime history, but Genie Francis was treated like a disposable tool, useful only when ratings demanded her return. This was the true betrayal, not just being written out of storylines, but being denied the right to evolve as both a character and a human being. Hollywood didn't want Genie, it wanted Laura. And when Genie could no longer fit the fantasy, it turned its back without hesitation, leaving her to carry the pain of being erased from the very role that had defined her life. For decades, Genie Francis endured in silence. She smiled for cameras, signed autographs, and returned to General Hospital whenever the producers needed a ratings boost, all while carrying wounds that were never acknowledged. She played her part as the obedient star, the woman who owed her life to the role of Laura. But beneath that silence, a storm was building. At 62, she finally decided she would no longer live behind the mask. No more apologizing for her body. No more acting as though she belonged only to the audience. No more forcing herself to swallow the pain that had defined her youth. After years of being judged against a frozen image of who she was at 19, Genie declared that her voice, long ignored, mattered. Her words were not meant to destroy the legend of Luke and Laura, nor to strip away the memories people cherished. They were meant to reveal the human being behind the myth, the woman who carried the burden of a love story that never truly belonged to her. She wanted people to understand that Laura Spencer might have been America's dream bride, but Genie Francis was something far more complicated. A survivor who endured the price of being turned into a fantasy. "If you ever loved Luke and Laura," she said, "if you ever believed in that fairy tale romance, then it's time you also hear my story. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't revenge. It was truth, raw, long-suppressed truth. And in finally speaking it, Genie reclaimed not just her narrative, but her dignity. Long before the glare of studio lights or the frenzy of soap opera fame, Genie Francis was simply a little girl growing up in Englewood, New Jersey. Born on May 26, 1962, she was raised in a modest home where the dreams of Hollywood felt both close at hand and impossibly far away. Unlike many of her peers in the industry, She was not the child of moguls or stars with mansions on the hills. Her family lived quietly, guided more by work than glamour. Her father, Genie Francis, was a seasoned character actor. He wasn't the kind of man whose name appeared in bold letters on a marquee, but he was respected by those who knew the craft. He played professors, doctors, priests, the kinds of roles that slipped into stories without demanding attention yet left an undeniable mark. From him, Genie absorbed her first lesson. Acting wasn't about glory, it was about persistence, discipline, and learning to exist in the background. Watching him, she learned that the heart of performance was often invisible, and that respect was sometimes earned without applause. Her mother, Rosemary Daly, had once been a performer herself, but she stepped away from the stage to become a homemaker, anchoring the family quietly in the shadows. Genie grew up watching a woman who knew what it meant to let go of a dream, to take care of others, and that sacrifice, though unspoken, left an impression on her daughter. The Francis household wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, teaching Genie humility in a world that often confused fame with worth. She understood early that being in front of a camera did not make someone more important, and that lesson would cut deep years later when Hollywood demanded she become a flawless icon. Even as a child, she was already living between two realities: the ordinary routines of homework, classrooms, and playgrounds, and the backstage corridors of television, where her father sometimes brought her along because the family couldn't afford childcare. While other kids played with dolls, Genie sat silently on folding chairs, watching her father rehearse his lines, absorbing rhythm, emotion, and craft. She didn't yet know she would become an actress, but something in those quiet observations lit a fire that would one day carry her onto the screen. As Genie grew, her life unfolded across two very different landscapes. On one side, she was just another girl in an ordinary classroom, sitting at a wooden desk, raising her hand to answer questions, walking home with friends who worried about homework and weekend plans. On the other side, she was a silent witness to the working world of Hollywood, trailing behind her father into rehearsal rooms, cramped sound stages, and the hushed corridors where actors prepared themselves before stepping into the lights. Her family could not afford childcare, so while other children went to after-school programs or played outside, Genie often sat quietly in the back of a studio, watching her father transform into professors, clergymen, or kindly doctors. Those hours left a permanent imprint. She noticed every pause in his delivery, the way he shifted his shoulders to embody authority, the subtle inflection that gave depth to even the smallest roles. She didn't yet understand the techniques, but she absorbed the essence. Acting was about observing, listening, and carrying truth even in fiction. It was a strange kind of apprenticeship. While her classmates played with dolls or dreamed about becoming teachers and nurses, Genie rehearsed silently in her mind, studying the art of expression without even realizing it. Her childhood toys were the lines of dialogue her father practiced in the car ride home, the stage directions he muttered under his breath. This unusual upbringing gave her a sensitivity beyond her years. She became a careful observer of people, how a teacher's voice softened when encouraging a shy student, how a neighbor's posture betrayed worry even when their smile suggested calm. These details, unnoticed by most children, became the raw material that would later allow her to project a depth far beyond her age. Living in two worlds also gave her an early sense of displacement. She wasn't fully a child of Hollywood, with wealth and connections, but she wasn't entirely ordinary either. She occupied a fragile in-between space, an outsider in both realms. It was here, in that tension, that the foundation of Genie Francis, the actress, began to take shape. By the time Genie Francis turned 14, the years of quiet observation were beginning to bear fruit. She had never attended an elite drama school, never worked with private coaches the way many child actors did. Instead, her education came from the countless hours of watching her father perform and from her own natural instinct to study people. That instinct was what caught the eye of a casting director when she auditioned for the family drama family in 1976. The director later explained why she was chosen. She has the look of someone who's endured something. At that age, Genie had not yet lived through major heartbreaks or traumas, but she carried herself with a kind of quiet gravity. Her stillness, her tendency to observe rather than dominate a room, gave her a depth that was unusual for someone so young. The role in Family was small, but it marked the first time Genie realized that the world saw something in her that she hadn't seen in herself. Acting wasn't just about speaking lines, it was about carrying invisible weight, the kind of weight people recognized even if they couldn't explain why. And Genie carried it effortlessly. Barely a year later, lightning struck. At only 15, she was cast as Laura Webber on General Hospital. She was still in high school, still navigating homework and friendships, but now she was stepping onto a set that would soon change television history. At first, she thought it would be another brief role, one more stepping stone in a career she hadn't even fully decided to pursue. But Hollywood had other plans. Genie was still a child, never in love, never worldly, never aware of what fame could take away. She didn't think of herself as particularly beautiful compared to the glamorous faces on magazine covers. She certainly didn't believe she was ready to carry a story that would define an era. Yet none of that mattered. Hollywood didn't wait for her to be ready. It simply threw her onto the screen, dressed her in the image of innocence, and told her to swim in waters far deeper than she could comprehend. And so, before she had even finished growing up, Laura was born, a character that would become larger than life, even as Genie herself was still just a girl trying to figure out who she was. When Genie Francis first stepped onto the set of General Hospital in 1977, she had no illusions of grandeur. She didn't arrive with an army of agents behind her or a carefully mapped-out strategy for stardom. To her, it was just another role, perhaps a stepping stone, perhaps a fleeting job. Laura Webber was supposed to be a minor character, a rebellious teenage girl designed to stir the pot in a few storylines before fading into the background. But something unexpected happened. Within only a few months, audiences began to notice her. There was something magnetic about the way she carried herself on screen. Laura was flawed, she wasn't always polished. Her reactions weren't scripted to perfection, and yet that very imperfection resonated. Her blonde hair framed a face that seemed perpetually caught between innocence and sorrow. Her eyes carried sadness, but not fragility. And in those eyes, viewers saw a truth that transcended daytime television. Suddenly, Laura was no longer just a side character. She became a mirror in which millions of Americans saw their own vulnerabilities and longings. The network noticed the rising tide of letters, fan reactions, and rating spikes, and quickly elevated Laura's role. Genie, still in high school, was suddenly thrust into the heart of a cultural phenomenon she couldn't possibly have predicted. Behind the scenes, she was just a teenager, struggling to keep up balancing scripts with schoolwork, waking up before dawn to spend long hours on set, all while still trying to navigate the normal chaos of adolescence. But there was no time for her to grow at her own pace. Hollywood was impatient. The audience wanted more Laura, and the producers demanded Genie deliver, ready or not. What began as a supporting role transformed into the defining role of her life. And with every scene she filmed, Laura grew into America's sweetheart, while Genie slowly realized that she herself was being swallowed by the character she had created. By 1979, the writers of General Hospital decided to gamble with a storyline so controversial it would become one of the most infamous in daytime history. They took Laura, a teenage girl portrayed by a real-life 17-year-old Genie Francis, and placed her in the path of Luke Spencer, a hustler written to be complex, dangerous, and oddly charming. The pivotal scene was not love at first sight. It was an assault. For Genie, still barely out of childhood, the experience was bewildering. She was directed by men twice her age to perform a scene that was harrowing even for adults, yet she was given no guidance on how to process its meaning. There were no conversations about trauma, no acknowledgement of what it represented for a girl her age. Instead, she was instructed to deliver the moment as though it were not the destruction of innocence, but the spark of something romantic. And then came the twist that changed everything. The network rewrote the assault into a love story. What should have been a narrative about survival and healing became the foundation for daytime television's most celebrated couple. Viewers were told to see Luke not as Laura's attacker, but as her destined soulmate. Millions of fans believed it. Ratings soared. The media christened them the super couple, and a new chapter in soap opera history was born. But behind the scenes, Genie was quietly unraveling. Years later, she admitted, "I felt lost. No one asked me if I was okay. No one told me it was wrong. They just said, 'The audience likes it. Keep going.'" She was asked to look at her on-screen attacker with longing, to transform horror into desire, to act as though violence could be rewritten as passion. The entire weight of that contradiction fell on her young shoulders. The audience saw romance. Genie felt exploitation. And in that gulf between perception and reality, a wound was carved that would shape the rest of her career. For America, Luke and Laura became a fairy tale. For Genie Francis, the fairy tale began as a nightmare she was never allowed to wake from. The pressure that followed the infamous storyline was relentless. Genie Francis was just a teenager, yet the responsibility of carrying one of the most talked-about plots in television history was forced onto her shoulders. Every day on set was a reminder that she no longer had a voice in her own work, or even in her own image. The only thing that seemed to matter was how the audience reacted, and the audience was cheering. Executives and producers measured her value not by her well-being, but by the ratings. And as long as the numbers climbed, no one paused to consider the cost to the young girl at the center of it all. Genie wasn't treated as a child who needed protection. She was treated as a product that needed to keep performing, regardless of the damage being done. She remembered vividly the instructions she was given. Look at him with longing. Smile through the pain. Remember, the audience loves this. No one asked if she was frightened, if she understood the gravity of acting out trauma disguised as romance. There was no therapist on set, no mentor pulling her aside to check if she was coping. Instead, silence became the rule. Her discomfort was invisible, buried beneath the machine of daytime television. And Genie obeyed, because she didn't know what else to do. She was too young to push back, too inexperienced to argue, and too naive to realize she had a right to say no. She believed the adults around her, the writers, the directors, the producers, must know what was best. So she carried the burden quietly, doing what she was told, even as a part of her spirit began to fracture. The irony was brutal. While America hailed Luke and Laura as the ultimate love story, Genie was learning her first real lesson about Hollywood, that in the chase for ratings, a young actress's well-being could be sacrificed without hesitation. She wasn't just playing a role. She was living out the industry's willingness to exploit innocence for entertainment. As the Luke and Laura phenomenon swept across America, Genie Francis found herself trapped inside a whirlwind she could neither control nor escape. She was still a teenager, but her life no longer resembled anything close to ordinary. While her classmates were worrying about exams, prom dates, and summer jobs, Genie was waking up at 4 in the morning to prepare for a grueling filming schedule. Days stretched into nights on set, often lasting until 10 or 11 o'clock. In between, she had to memorize dozens of pages of dialogue and somehow still smile whenever a camera was pointed at her. The press, intoxicated by the frenzy surrounding Luke and Laura, scrutinized every detail of her existence. Her hairstyle was dissected in gossip columns, her smile analyzed in magazines, her weight turned into national conversation. It was as if her body had become public property, endlessly judged against an image of the perfect, all-American sweetheart. Every pound gained, every imperfect angle captured by a camera, became ammunition for tabloid ridicule. Friends she once knew began to drift away. The normal joys of adolescence, birthday parties, trips to the mall, silly teenage romances were stripped from her by the all-consuming glare of fame. When she did attempt to join in, she often felt like an outsider, as though she no longer belonged to their world. She had outgrown it, not by choice, but because Hollywood had forced her to. And yet, despite being everywhere on magazine covers, in living rooms across the country, Genie began to feel increasingly invisible. The world saw Laura, the radiant heroine of General Hospital, but no one seemed to care about Genie, the girl behind the character. Her laughter, her exhaustion, her fear, her longing to be understood, those things went unnoticed. To fans and executives alike, she was only valuable so long as she played the part that had been written for her. What the public saw as America's sweetheart was, in truth, a young woman silently unraveling. The more the spotlight intensified, the more she disappeared inside it. By 1981, the story of Luke and Laura had become more than just a soap opera plotline. It was a cultural tidal wave. Their wedding was advertised not simply as another episode of General Hospital, but as the event of the year. On the 17th of November, nearly 30 million people tuned in, a number unheard of for daytime television. Housewives stopped their chores, workers snuck into break rooms, and even people who had never watched a single episode before switched on their TVs. For that single afternoon, America seemed to hold its breath. On screen, it was the ultimate fairy tale. Laura, radiant in her gown, walked down the aisle as if she were stepping into happily ever after. Luke waited at the altar, the reformed rogue now redeemed by love. The nation swooned as vows were exchanged, as rings were slipped onto fingers, as a kiss sealed what would be remembered as the wedding of the century. But behind the veil, Genie Francis wasn't living a dream, she was barely surviving it. At only 19 years old, she was asked to embody the fantasy of eternal love for an entire country. The studio lights bore down on her, hot and unyielding, while the weight of millions of eyes turned her into something she never volunteered to be. A symbol. She was still a teenager who had never experienced love, never fully believed in happy endings, and yet she was expected to convince the world otherwise. What no one watching understood was that the wedding marked the beginning of a different kind of imprisonment. From that moment on, Genie was no longer seen as an actress who could grow, change, and explore new roles. She became Laura frozen in time, bound forever to that image of the perfect bride. The public didn't want Genie Francis. They wanted the fairy tale they had celebrated. And that meant Genie was no longer free to be herself. In the same moment that America crowned her its sweetheart, Genie quietly began to lose her own identity. The applause was deafening, but in her heart, it felt less like triumph and more like surrender. When Genie Francis finally stepped away from General Hospital in 1982, she carried with her a fragile hope that outside of Laura Spencer's shadow, she might finally discover who she was meant to be as an actress. She was barely 20, still at the start of her adult life, and she dreamed that Hollywood would give her a chance to prove she was more than the face of a soap opera. Her first big opportunity came with Bare Essence, a high-budget NBC miniseries that promised glitz, ambition, and a fresh start. Genie poured herself into the lead role, determined to carve a new identity. But after just one season, the show was abruptly canceled. She barely had time to find her footing before the rug was pulled from under her. Next came North and South, a sweeping historical drama set during the Civil War, and one of the most talked-about television events of the 1982nd. Surrounded by an all-star cast, Genie delivered a strong performance as Brett Hazard, earning praise for her work. But the reviews often carried a cruel twist. Rather than seeing her as Brett, the media referred to her as Laura in hoop skirts, or Laura playing dress-up in another time period. No matter how hard she tried, the name she wanted to leave behind followed her everywhere. In interview after interview, she admitted her frustration. "I tried everything to get away from Laura, but they wouldn't let me leave. And the worst part was, I wasn't allowed to be anyone else either." That bitter truth cut deeper than any bad review. Hollywood had locked her in a box too famous as Laura to be cast as someone new, yet not valuable enough to be given the freedom to reinvent herself. It was the cruelest kind of trap. When she was on General Hospital, she was smothered by the weight of Laura. When she left, she was haunted by her ghost. Genie discovered that the shadow of one character could be more powerful than any opportunity, and the more she tried to run from it, the more inescapable it became. For the public, Laura was a beloved icon. For Genie, Laura had become a chain. What Genie Francis quickly discovered was that Hollywood didn't truly want her, it only wanted the idea of Laura Spencer. Time and again, she was pulled back into the world of General Hospital, not out of love or loyalty, but as a tool for ratings. Whenever the show needed a boost, they revived Laura. And just as quickly, when she no longer fit their vision, she was discarded without hesitation. It became a cycle of exploitation. She would return to thunderous applause. Her face splashed across magazine covers. Her character hailed as the heartbeat of the series. But the adoration never lasted. Producers treated her less like an artist and more like a switch they could flip on and off to serve their bottom line. Once the ratings climbed, they no longer needed Genie, and she was written out with cold efficiency. The cruelty reached its peak in 2002. Exhausted, battling anxiety and depression from years of non-stop pressure, Genie asked for a short break to care for her health. Instead of offering understanding, the producers found the simplest solution. They wrote Laura into a coma. No grand farewell, no acknowledgement of the decades she had given to the show, not even a respectful goodbye scene. Just a quick plot device to erase her presence like a prop pushed into storage. Meanwhile, her co-star Anthony Geary, who played Luke, was elevated to near-legend status. He was praised as an actor of rare depth, given creative control over storylines, and celebrated as a man who redefined masculinity in soap operas. Genie, in contrast, was endlessly reduced to two words: beautiful and sweet. There were no groundbreaking arcs written for her, no reinvention offered, no recognition that she too was capable of carrying stories of complexity and power. On top of that, the press twisted the knife further. They mocked her body, ridiculing her for gaining weight. Headlines sneered that Laura had let herself go, that she was no longer the all-American dream girl she once was. To executives, this was simply viewer feedback. But to Genie, it was devastating rejection. She wasn't being judged as an actress, or even as a person. She was being punished for aging, for daring to look different from the frozen memory audiences clung to. It was in these repeated rejections that Genie learned the harshest truth of all. In Hollywood, a woman was not allowed to change, and if she did, she was punished for it. For most actors, leaving behind a defining television role can open doors to film, theater, or more challenging projects. But for Genie Francis, every door seemed to slam shut before she even reached it. Casting directors didn't see potential in her, they saw baggage. To them, she wasn't Genie, she was Laura, forever imprinted in the minds of millions. And that label clung to her like a shadow. When she auditioned for films, executives dismissed her as too familiar. They claimed she was too famous to play a supporting role but not glamorous enough to carry a blockbuster lead. She was trapped in an impossible paradox. Her fame made her visible, but it also made her unusable. The name Laura Spencer entered the room before she did, drowning out whatever talent she tried to bring. In one interview, she admitted bluntly, "I wasn't given a shot. They decided who I was before I even walked into the room." Meanwhile, the media subjected her to a cruel second punishment: her body. Every fluctuation in her weight became tabloid fodder. Instead of acknowledging her talent, journalists reduced her to headlines about diets and before and after photos. When she gained weight, they sneered that she had let herself go. When she lost it, they accused her of desperation. There was no winning. Hollywood could forgive men for aging. Anthony Geary, her co-star, was allowed to disappear to Europe and re-emerge as a mysterious, seasoned actor. His wrinkles became symbols of depth, his solitude a mark of intrigue. Genie, on the other hand, was afforded no such grace. A few extra pounds, and whispers began, "She doesn't look like Laura anymore." In meetings, producers quietly suggested lower camera angles to slim her face or breaks from filming until she fit the image again. The message was clear: She was no longer valuable if she didn't look like the teenage girl she once was. Her identity, her artistry, even her humanity, were overshadowed by an industry that worshipped nostalgia while punishing reality. To the public, she was a legend frozen in time. To Hollywood, she was a declining product, worth keeping on the shelf only when convenient. And to Genie, caught in the middle, it felt like a slow erasure of everything she had worked for, not because she lacked talent, but because she dared to grow older in a business that demanded women remain forever young. Amid the turbulence of her professional life, Genie Francis found something that many of her Hollywood peers never did: an anchor. In 1982, while working on the miniseries Bare Essence, she met actor Jonathan Frakes, best known for his role as Commander Riker in Star Trek: The Next Generation. At the time, Genie had just walked away from General Hospital, carrying the exhaustion of years spent under the spotlight and the gnawing fear that she might never be free of Laura's shadow. Jonathan was different from the men she had worked with in daytime television. He wasn't dazzled by her fame or intent on exploiting her image. Instead, he saw Genie, the shy young woman who smiled politely, even when she was unsure, the actress who had been forced to mature long before her time. At first, theirs wasn't a storybook romance. They didn't fall into each other's arms instantly, but slowly, Jonathan's warmth, wit, and steadiness became the balm to the wounds Genie had long carried in silence. By 1988, they were married, a rare Hollywood union without scandal, tabloid drama, or carefully orchestrated PR campaigns. Together, they built a life grounded not in glamour but in authenticity. They raised 2 children, Jameson and Elizabeth, deliberately shielding them from the relentless hunger of Hollywood spotlight. For Genie, motherhood was both a joy and a quiet act of rebellion. She chose a life of PTA meetings, grocery store runs, and afternoons in the garden over the suffocating expectations of always being Laura. But even as she embraced this quieter existence, the public refused to let her go. Tabloids cruelly framed her transition into family life as failure. Headlines sneered that Laura has become a housewife, as though stepping out of the spotlight was shameful. The same audiences who had adored her at 19 now condemned her for aging, for gaining weight after pregnancy, for daring to live like any other woman. The double standard was impossible to ignore. Male stars were allowed to grow older, to disappear for years, and return hailed as dignified or mysterious. Genie, however, was judged for every wrinkle, every pound, every absence. She confessed years later that she often sat curled up in the bathroom, crying quietly because the mirror reflected not her husband's love or her children's admiration, but the disappointment imposed by a world that only wanted to see Laura. Yet Jonathan remained her constant. In interviews, he has often said, "Genie is the strongest person I've ever known." He didn't shield her from pain. He reminded her that she had the right to stand in it, to survive it, and to define her own worth. Their marriage became a sanctuary, a space where Genie was not an icon, not a commodity, not Laura, but simply a woman who deserved to be loved exactly as she was. Even with the love and stability Jonathan Frakes gave her, Genie Francis could not completely escape the shadow that had haunted her since she was 15 years old. The world refused to separate her from Laura Spencer, and every public appearance became an interrogation of how well she still fit the mold of America's sweetheart. It was not just exhausting, it was crushing. For years, Genie battled depression, a struggle she kept hidden behind carefully rehearsed smiles. She relied on medication, therapy, and long periods of retreat from the public eye. These absences, instead of being respected as a woman's attempt to heal, only fueled more tabloid speculation. Gossip magazines and television columns churned out cruel questions. Was she fired again? Has she gained weight? Is Laura gone forever? The irony was bitter. While her co-star Anthony Geary could disappear to Europe and be celebrated as enigmatic, Genie's silence was painted as weakness, laziness, or proof of decline. The emotional weight of such double standards took its toll. She admitted later that there were nights she would collapse in tears, not from scandal or public attack, but from the quiet violence of being unseen. To the industry, She wasn't Genie Francis, a working actress and mother. She was simply Laura, a product to be judged, recycled, or discarded. Jonathan, for his part, became her anchor through these storms. Over 3 decades of marriage, he stood beside her not as a rescuer but as a witness, someone who reminded her of a truth she had never been taught. She had the right to exist beyond the role that made her famous. "No one gets to decide your worth but you," he often told her. Those words, simple yet profound, slowly helped her reclaim pieces of herself that had been lost. Together, they raised their children, Jameson and Elizabeth, far from Hollywood's hunger. Genie carved out a private life where she could shop for groceries, garden, or read a book without being asked about Laura. Yet even in these moments of peace, the past was never far behind. Each return to General Hospital, no matter how brief, reopened old wounds, producers nitpicking her appearance, tabloids snapping before and after photos, whispers that she no longer looked like the girl in the white wedding gown from 1981. Her silence during these years wasn't a sign of contentment. It was the silence of someone who had grown tired of explaining, tired of justifying her right to change. The world may have loved Laura Spencer, but it never asked if Genie Francis was okay. And those unasked questions, those unspoken dismissals, became scars as deep as any headline ever written. For much of her career, Genie Francis lived in the shadow of Laura Spencer, a character celebrated, commodified, and endlessly recycled. Yet with time, she learned to reclaim the very role that once imprisoned her. By the time she entered her 52nd and 62nd, she was no longer willing to play Laura as the flawless, eternally young bride audiences remembered from 1981. Instead, she brought back Laura as a fully grown woman, one marked by loss, resilience, and the same scars she herself carried. It wasn't an easy victory. Her later returns to General Hospital were often accompanied by abrupt dismissals and callous treatment. In 2002, when exhaustion and anxiety overwhelmed her, the producers wrote Laura into a coma, a cold, clinical way to erase decades of work without even granting her a farewell. In 2011, she was invited back only to be cut again within months, with no explanation. To many, it looked like rejection, but to Genie, those comebacks were proof of her endurance. No matter how many times she was written out, she always found a way back. And then, in 2018, something shifted. After more than 4 decades in the industry, Genie won her first Daytime Emmy. When her name was called, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. It wasn't just about the award, it was recognition long overdue, a collective acknowledgement of what audiences had known for years. Genie Francis didn't simply play Laura Spencer, she created her. She gave the character flesh, soul, and authenticity that no script alone could deliver. Her legacy, however, isn't confined to trophies. Genie redefined what a soap opera heroine could be. Laura wasn't perfect. She was a survivor of trauma, a woman with contradictions, a character who made mistakes and bore scars. And yet, because of Genie's performance, audiences loved her all the more. She and Anthony Geary together birthed television's first true super couple, setting a blueprint for decades of soap romances to follow. Beau and Hope, Ridge and Brooke, Sonny and Carly. All of them owed a debt to Luke and Laura, and therefore to Genie. Off-screen, her legacy lies in her quiet defiance. She never unleashed public tirades, never humiliated her colleagues in interviews, never weaponized her pain for tabloid spectacle. Instead, she resisted simply by returning, by continuing to exist authentically, by refusing to apologize for aging, gaining weight, or daring to change. In a world that demanded she remain frozen at 19, Genie Francis survived by becoming fully herself. Today, at 62, she lives in Maine, far from Hollywood's glare, in a house, by a lake, surrounded by pine trees. She gardens, cooks, reads, and spends time with Jonathan and their children. And when she does return to General Hospital, she does so on her own terms, no longer to please the fans, but to embody a Laura who has grown, aged, and endured just as she has. As she once said with a quiet smile, "Laura is big enough now to hold all of me." Her story is not about scandal, lawsuits, or loud rebellion. It is about endurance, dignity, and the strength of a woman who refused to let others define her worth. Genie Francis may not have the towering film career Hollywood once promised, but she has something rarer, a legacy etched not in glamour, but in truth. For every viewer who saw themselves in her eyes, who felt her fragility and her courage, Genie Francis remains unforgettable. Because in the end, she proved something Hollywood never wanted to admit, that a woman doesn't need to stay young, silent, or perfect to deserve love, respect, and her place in history.